2 sessions on strategic planning. This part of the program may feel a bit different from the rest, for its focus on the future rather than on the immediate challenges we all are facing. I invite you to make a connection between the two. We began strategic planning in July 2019, well before the world changed. The events of this spring and summer demand both short and long-term actions. I ask you, as you hear about the strategic plan and think about the implementation, is it positioning CRA well for appropriate longer-term action? I want to take you quickly through the process we have used to arrive at today. Let me say at the outset that the timing of Snowbird 2020 was key in structuring the schedule. Frankly, we could have moved more quickly, but from the beginning, we wanted to use Snowbird 2020 as an opportunity to get input from CRA members. We just didn't know it would be in this format. The strategic planning process began in earnest after the board meeting in summer 2019. And at that meeting, the full board agreed that the time and resources to do strategic planning right were worth it at this point in time in the organization's history. At that point, we formed a 9-person strategic plan steering committee broadly representing CRA's constituents. And I want to thank that group for their hard work over the last year. The fall was primarily dedicated to landscape analysis by the consulting firm Greenway Strategies that we hired to help us with the process. Martha and her team conducted 23 interviews with thought leaders and 6 focus group discussions, and then distilled those into findings that we could use as we moved forward. In January, we began the iterative process of creating a framework of priority outcomes and strategic themes. These are different, although they sound the same, and that difference matters. Priority outcomes are customer-focused results that define the organization's value and benefits. Strategic themes are areas where CRA must enhance its work to achieve these outcomes. They're not supposed to match up one-to-one. That is, there may be areas in which CRA needs to enhance its work, and that those will then be valuable in achieving multiple outcomes. The steering committee produced the first version of these, and the board provided input at the February board meeting. Shortly after that, we went into COVID mode. Coming out of March and April, we turned to the more operational aspects of the plan, drafting objectives and initiatives against each theme. We also revisited the CRA mission statement in light of the developing plan. I want to thank Ayanna Howard for leading the group doing that work on the mission statement. The current version of all these pieces was discussed in the CRA board meeting yesterday, and here we are today. Now let me turn to introducing Martha Greenway, head of Greenway Strategy Group. We selected Greenway in a competitive process and chose them because of their experience working with national nonprofits and with higher ed, as well as for their analysis-based process. Not coincidentally, Martha's recent work includes assisting the College of Engineering at Georgia Tech in their strategic planning process. And now I'd like to turn it over to Martha.
Thanks, Ellen. And now I'm going to provide a brief summary of our analysis findings. As you see on this slide, there were a number of strengths and opportunities for enhancement that were identified regarding CRA. On the strengths side, the fact that CRA is a neutral voice for the community is extremely valued. It represents a broad range of computing research areas and also a broad range of organizations. The organization has tremendous external credibility, which can then be leveraged to influence federal policy, which it has done quite successfully in the past. The convening and networking role of the organization is highly valued. Events such as this conference and best practices workshops and mentoring gatherings and other events. The data analysis role, and in particular, the Talibi survey, which is utilized by many and very, very valued. The effectiveness of staff, addressing the research pipeline and particularly widening participation of those in the research pipeline. The inclusivity of the organization, again, the types of organizations that are included. The extent and quality of volunteer support. So when one thinks that the products and resources of CRA are largely produced through the volunteer energy of its members, events such as this conference and best practices papers and other memos, this is extremely valued, and the ability of CRA to leverage this level of energy and expertise is seen as unparalleled. In the opportunities for enhancement, We did hear that people perceived that there needed to be more alignment and integration of the work of CRA, that there was opportunity to greater amplify its impact by pursuing things along a common agenda or an additive set of issues that were being explored. There's a perception that things are rather random and disconnected, and also that groups may be working on issues that are tangential to each other that could come together to magnify the benefit for the field, but they're not aware of each other. They're working in silos. The CRA membership mix and participation, while the organization is inclusive, the membership definitely leans heavily towards large academic organizations, and there's a perception that that could be broadened. The external awareness and partnership. So there seems to be opportunity for greater partnerships both in interdisciplinary areas, but also with the sister organizations that are tangential to CRA, such as IEEE. And that there's greater opportunity for awareness of CRA, even within the member organizations, where oftentimes the member contact is the only one who has a clear lens to the resources and the benefits of CRA. The education pipeline in general, so while there's been tremendous effort around widening participation, there is a sense that the computing research education pipeline in general could use some support and some resources from CRA. Government relations, while clearly federal policy influence is seen as a tremendous strength, there's also a sense that CRA could be more proactively involved in influencing government policy, and also that the agencies with the potential to influence computing research go well beyond the science and technology organizations of the past and are now inclusive of agencies throughout the federal government, such as the Federal Aviation Administration, the Transportation Safety Administration, the USDA. Although the Talby survey, as mentioned, is tremendously valued, there's a sense that even with that, the data set is so rich that more analysis could be done for benefit of the field, more querying. And also that there needs to be an evenness in the quality of research around all of the best practices work and other products that are coming out of CRA, all of which are of high quality, but there is a sense that there could be a higher level of uniformity in the rigor that's applied to those. And so then we also asked about emerging opportunities and threats to the computing research ecosystem. And the thing that we heard most frequently were concerns about the societal implications of computing research. Techlash was a phrase we heard often. The concern that the implications of applications in areas such as artificial intelligence, privacy, security, and data integrity, as well as others, could lead to negative consequences, or the perception that computing research was being leveraged for things that were harmful or that people were alarmed about, and that this could then result in policies that were limiting to computing research in ways that were inappropriate or put boundaries on the potential. So a real desire for CRA to get in front of this issue. Additionally, a concern that the many positive benefits of computing research for society were not being universally understood. We also heard about a number of concerns in academia. We heard concerns about the exponential enrollment growth in computer science and other fields that could lead into computing research, and concerns about the ability to maintain the quality faculty and facilities that would be needed to support these students. We heard concerns about increasing competition for funding, as well as concerns that the actual pool of funding may be reduced. Concerns about the pipeline of graduate students, that students in computing research have many other career choices, and would the pipeline for computing research be maintained in academia. The diversity of academic computing research, both on the faculty and researcher side, but also on the student side. And then finally, with this exponential growth, concerns that the quality of and rigor of research review be maintained. We heard concerns about integration with other fields. So as already mentioned, the applications of computing research are really ubiquitous, and the need to work with other fields, such as the medical field, the transportation field, infrastructure, even food safety. Those are issues that computing research can address, and there needs to be an opportunity for the field to have integration with those working in those other fields as well. In addition, we heard, as I already mentioned, the potential policy implications across disciplines and the need for computing research to now work with fields such as ethics and law and public policy to really think through some of these implications. And then we heard about some opportunities and issues with industry computing research. So on one hand, we heard from academia about some concerns regarding competition from industry research, specifically competition for talent and competition for research funding. But on the other hand, we also heard about tremendous opportunity for partnership with industry research. So the capability of industry research in areas such as quantum computing, in areas such as data science and data management, and the volume of data that industry research is able to maintain and manage, that in many ways these cannot be replicated within academia. And so the opportunity for partnership so that the capacity of industry can be utilized by academia to further computing research. And also a notion of partnership and fluidity around the workforce pipeline. Notion that we have academia on one side of the wall and industry on the other side of the wall, and people have to make a choice about jumping over the wall from one side to the other is really artificial and outmoded. And so now career paths are much more seamless and also can be integrated through partnerships so that people could have mutual roles that are beneficial to both industry and academia. And then lastly, we heard about some specific computing technologies that have a tremendous potential for computing research. These will continue to grow and will probably include things that we can't even imagine right now. So the message here is that CRA has got to be continually assessing the landscape and attuned to these emerging technologies and working with the field to influence those in positive ways through computing research. And so one of the things that we heard very clearly is that people are looking for leadership in these areas, and that they perceive that CRA is uniquely positioned to provide leadership to the field, to convene people, to understand these issues and opportunities, to come forward with positions, and to lead the field in response, and also in positioning the field in advance so that the field is ready to take advantage and leverage these emerging opportunities and threats. So now I'm going to move into a description of the strategic plan, and I want to start by going over some of the terminology that we'll be using. So the mission statement is a descriptive statement of the purpose of the organization. It describes why the organization exists, what benefit it provides. And then, as Ellen already referenced, our priority outcomes are those specific customer-focused results that define the organization's value and benefits, and that can be measured. We then identify a set of strategic themes, which are the areas within the work of the organization that have to be addressed, that have to be enhanced, improved, created, redesigned in order to achieve those priority outcomes. Within each strategic theme, we then identify a set of objectives, which represent the choices we're making about the specific areas that we will address in order to bring about and leverage what we need to achieve our priority outcomes. And then we move into the methods. So the strategic initiatives outline the specific projects that will be implemented to achieve the objectives within each strategic theme and accomplish the priority outcomes. We haven't yet developed the action plans, and part of that reasoning is because we want your input between today and tomorrow about the important factors for success that must be considered as the implementation of these initiatives is designed. And also because we want your sense of priority about which of these areas are the most critical to implement first. So next I want to talk briefly about the overall strategy for CRA. And so when some organizations move into a strategic plan, they essentially redesign the organization. They reposition it. They define value in completely new and different ways. They might even define new markets or new customers. It's as if we decide the house that we're in is no longer working and we're going to build a completely new one. Well, that is not the strategy that is being proposed for CRA. CRA has a very solid foundation, and we like where CRA is positioned in the community. We like the infrastructure. And so we want to maintain and build on the strengths and capabilities and assets that the organization already has. But we recognize that based on our analysis phase, there are some new areas and some new areas of value where CRA could enhance its work. So we're going to build on. We're going to build on to that structure. We're going to build on to that infrastructure. We're going to maintain our footprint and our position in the community, and yet enhance the work in some new areas that are responsive to what the field is looking for. So the draft mission for CRA is to catalyze computing research by joining with industry, government, and academia, and to execute this mission by leading the computing research community, informing policymakers and the public, and championing a diverse, welcoming, equitable, and socially responsible computing research community. And as we mentioned, we're not starting from scratch. We're building on a solid foundation and an infrastructure that already exists and an established position in the community. And so with our priority outcomes, CRA will continue to excel as a source of content and resources, a cultivator of novel approaches, a respected voice of the computing research community, a champion for a diverse, welcoming, and equitable computing research community, while adding value in some new areas as a leader in promoting socially responsible computing research, and as a catalyst for academic, government, and industry computing research organizations to enhance the field, both as individual entities, but also collectively. And so the work of implementation will be done through 6 strategic themes, which will become the strands of effort. So strategic theme A is to prioritize and focus CRA effort. Strategic theme B is to leverage the capacity of the CRA network. Strategic theme C is inform the field of emerging practices, and then to expand partnerships and connections, strengthen pathways and diversify the field, and increase awareness of CRA value. So for each of these, let me do a quick overview of the objectives and initiatives. Under prioritize and focus CRA effort, the first objective is to establish a focus on socially responsible computing, and to do that in collaboration with the community to define the tenets and practices for socially responsible computing. To establish a transparent framework for the assessment and selection of activities that align to the mission and strategy, to bring about this alignment and integration that we heard about, by engaging the board in defining criteria and developing governance and decision-making frameworks and cycles. And then finally, to create mechanisms through which these potential areas of effort are proposed, identified, and selected. So first initiative in this area is to regularly inventory, assess, and evaluate CRA activity. So even though we're keeping our foundation and our position in the community, that doesn't mean we necessarily need to keep all the furniture we had in the house. So we need to make sure that what we're doing now is going to align with the future strategic direction, and to do that on a regular basis. And also develop a process for regular environmental scanning to ensure that CRA is responsive to issues that are emerging in the landscape. To implement inclusive processes for members to propose topics and projects, and to regularly consider the alignment of the organization's assets against those priority projects. In strategic theme B, leverage the capacity of the CRA network. There's an objective to increase engagement of member organizations and computing researchers, both by expanding participation to some new entities, such as academic programs within community college, historically Black colleges and universities, and other pipeline institutions for computing researchers. And then to broaden involvement of computing researchers from member organizations, so that it's not solely the member contact, as is often the case, who is familiar with the CRA resources and opportunities and is engaged in the organization, but to extend that to all computing researchers, faculty, and students who might be part of member organizations. To influence policy decisions that affect the computing research community, both by proactively influencing government policy in the broad array of agencies that have the potential to influence the work, as well as influencing systemic practices in industry and academia. to inform the field of emerging best practices by ensuring rigorous and comprehensive methods for CRA research, but also to enhance understanding of the positive impact of the computing research on society, so that as these best practices are identified, they're not just shared and communicated internally within the network, but they're also communicated broadly so that the positive impact of computing research on society is appreciated and understood. To expand partnerships and connections among the computing research community, specifically to enhance CRA's benefit to research, to other academic disciplines, and to government laboratory organizations, both by working in mutually beneficial partnerships, but also with government labs by expanding opportunities for membership. To strengthen the pathways and diversify the field of computing researchers, the objectives are to broaden awareness of the pathways into computing research. So working with sister organizations such as IEEE and ACM, recognizing that the many pathways into computing research have changed and evolved. And then support the pathways between industry experience and academic computing research programs specifically, so that that seamless integration and partnership is maximized. To broaden the diversity of thought and demographics in computing research. So enhancing awareness of the computing research opportunities to a broader student population, and then ensuring that as this diverse student group enters the computing research community, that there are best practices to ensure that that community is supportive. And then creating guidance for university graduate admission programs so that equity and experience is considered when assessing student readiness, and strengthen the preparation for computing researchers in general. And then finally, strategic theme F is increase awareness of CRA value by enhancing the utilization of CRA content, knowledge, and resources through institutionalizing targeted communications that are systemic and continuous, so that those who could potentially benefit from the CRA resources are receiving information that is specifically relevant to the work that they do, and organizing CRA resources in integrated and easily accessible systems so people can find what they need, to broaden and sustain sources of financial support. So enhance the value proposition to current and potential member organizations, so as people are making choices about what to do with their precious time, talent, attention, and money, that CRA is seen as a valuable entity. And then lastly, to seek additional funding sources aligned with the CRA mission, both in more broad and also deep funding, to support the new work that's being discussed and is part of the strategic plan. And then in the end, this will all fit on one page. And later on this afternoon and tomorrow morning, we're going to give you the opportunity to participate in an online forum to provide your insights about which of these objectives are most important to implement first, and also what critical considerations have to go into effect in order to influence the implementation of our strategic initiatives. But first, we're going to pause and take your questions. Thank you very much.
And let me just get myself where I'm visible here. So I'm going to address one of the questions that we have coming in about sharing the slides with colleagues. No, they are not confidential, and they will be posted on the conference site. And so I'm reading here that most of the conference materials was to post the slides and videos on the CRA website after the conference is over. And so if you go to cra.org following the meeting, and go to the conference site, then you will be able to identify these slides and download them there. And we appreciate people sharing those with others as well and distributing this information. And so I see a question here about, what, if any, is the role of CCC in supporting any of these themes? And so the first thing I would like to mention is that the work of the CRA committees really cuts across the theme. So it's not that one particular committee is going to pick up and march forward with the implementation of one particular theme, that there are opportunities for committees to work collaboratively, but also to direct their work towards specific initiatives within each of these themes. And so I'm going to stop and see if there are members of the group here who'd like to talk a little bit about anything they see as particularly relevant and informing the work of CCC going forward.
Is that it was created and remains a cooperative agreement with the National Science Foundation. So that means there are, so to the plus side to that is that there's some really generous funding that comes in to support the CCC and its activities. And that's something that CRA and I think the community have really benefited from. It also does constrain a bit the kinds of things that CCC can do. I mean, there's some flexibility, but as you all know, when we get an NSF award, we don't go off in a 180-degree different direction. So, CCC has some scoping connected to the source of its funding and the promises made in that funding. So that's a little bit different kind of answer from Martha's, which basically said, we don't want to pigeonhole the resources that we have in CRA to work on things. We don't want to pigeonhole them to specific items, but we also have to work within the scope and strengths that each of our component parts have. And it may be, in fact, it's likely we'll need to add some things to CRA so that we can execute on all of these things, because what we have was set up to execute on a certain set of objectives, and many of which we want to continue to push forward, but not that it would have necessarily anticipated everything. So Ben, maybe I want to turn it to you.
Sure, I think it's a great answer, Ellen. So I won't speak for the CCC. I'm not currently on the board, although I recently departed, but I will say that I think in many ways the mission does span multiple categories that are listed here as strategic objectives in the strategic themes, and there is a narrowness in as Ellen mentioned around the charter with the NSF support, but I do think too that the high level issues of broadening the reach, reaching to other communities to bring those innovative ideas into the computing research domain, taking the ideas forward, looking at, the charter of the CCC really is to push the boundaries of what research is doing, look where the trends are, where the innovation opportunities are. And, obviously, the integration with industry, that's part of that story. So many of the dimensions of what are thought of as the CRA charter here also overlap with the CCC.
Yes. And so it will definitely be a next step that each of the committees will review the strategic plan and utilize this to inform their work and their operating plans for the next years coming forward. I do want to pick up this next question, which is, what is CRA doing to broaden the diversity of thought within its own board? And what do you plan on doing going forward to ensure diverse representation? And I just want to comment here that sort of as I mentioned with the alignment of the committees, the alignment of the board is work that needs to happen as this strategic plan is implemented. The committee did not see that as a strand of a strategic initiative itself, but rather as a preparation step that needs to take place as the organization moves into this strategy. And so I'm going to stop here and see if there are any of the committee members in particular want to address this question of broadening the diversity of thought within the board itself and some steps that might need to be taken in that direction. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I'll jump in because Ellen just volunteered me, and I'm going to apologize. There's some construction going on right next to me, so you may hear a little bit of a sound overlap. I think this is a crucial issue, and I think we need to reach out more broadly to organizations or institutions that are not normally part of us. We heard a little bit about that. It could be historically black community colleges and universities. It could be community colleges. It could be other places. But I think the biggest thing is just to encourage many people to get engaged. Coming from an institution that is frequently complained about as being too much of an influence on CRA, I'm not there anymore. I think it's important to get people from a broad range of organizations to get engaged. So I would put it back to the community. Run for the board, participate in the committees, send things in to help us think about that broadening. I would add one last piece about the broadening, which is I think something you saw in the strategic plan is this notion of being proactive, which I think we need to do. And I think we also need to think about being socially responsible. And those are places where people from the community can really help CRA broaden out much more broadly.
Anyone else on that topic?
I'm happy to jump in and say something here.
Thanks, Andrea.
Sure. Certainly I can't speak for reorganization of the board in any definitive way, given that will be a process going forward and certainly go beyond the scope of any individual who's on it. But I did want to say something about the model of the CRA committees, and in particular about the CRA WP. So one of the ways in which we can get diverse representation into CRA and its board and committees is through the committees themselves. And CRA WP certainly is one place where we've been working very hard to diversify the kinds of institutions from which we have representation, the various demographics that are represented in computing and more broadly, and are having actually very serious conversations right now about ways in which we're still lacking and are working to improve the way we're doing things. So I guess the bottom line is that there's a lot of thought going on and a lot of really hard work going on to think about how to do diversification of our various committees, which also lead into the overall structure of how CRA really is doing its work. So that's a really solid and strong place for broad representation in addition to the board itself.
All right, Peter, do you want to address, there's a question coming in about, does CRA truly have a neutral voice and should it? So from a government policy standpoint, Peter, do you want to just talk a little bit about the neutrality of the CRA voice and how that delicate balance is maintained?
Sure. So our policy efforts are really focused at trying to leverage the fact that we're seen as a very credible voice representing the computing community by policymakers to lend as much as we can really technologically based advice based on our kind of view of what the current state of the computing research ecosystem looks like. So for the most part, that's meant we have been an advocate for the community, and that's kind of our standpoint. It's not a Republican standpoint, it's not a Democratic standpoint. It's fairly neutral in terms of value. Our value judgment is that more funding for research is good, and therefore we should advocate that. As the strategic planning process has gone forward, and as you'll hear more about in my talk tomorrow, our issue space is broadening, and that's in part because computing is becoming ubiquitous as an issue among policymakers. So there's a much bigger constituency of people on the Hill who are not just interested in the impacts of computing, but the computing research that led us to that point too. And so to the extent that we've adopted this thrust that we should have a socially responsible approach to computing research, we're kind of going to struggle, I think, as a policy committee to figure out how that translates itself into value and into advice for policymakers. And so we'll talk a lot about that tomorrow in my talk. I think the second part of my talk is pretty much around how we tackle these kind of evolving challenges for us as an organization. No, on general, our advice is not bipartisan. I mean, excuse me, it is bipartisan, and that's because our issues are largely bipartisan. We haven't taken too many what I would call really ideological steps. We've taken baby steps in that direction around voting technologies, and that's just recently. So, for example, we signed on to an open letter put together by AAAS about the importance of advising local officials and state officials to stay away from using internet voting in the upcoming election, just because it's the consensus of the community that can't be secured. That's about as far, I think, as a value judgment sort of step as we've taken as an organization, but I could see us evolving into taking similar steps based on the research community's kind of consensus opinion on this stuff as best we can glean.
And I just want to add that I think there's a difference between saying CRA is a neutral voice and saying CRA has no point of view, right? So CRA does have a point of view, but the point of view is cultivated in such a way that it is representative of the community. And so there is a balance there, but at least in our analysis, the perception is that CRA is doing a grand job of kind of maintaining that neutrality and being a credible voice for the community without, taking positions that are aligned with any, particular agenda other than what's best for the field. So does anybody else want to comment on this notion of neutrality, Eric?
If I could, Martha, just really quickly, I'm going to relate it back to something I said very briefly earlier, which partly relates to being neutral, and that is the issue of, as I said, being reactive versus proactive. CRA is the place to go on the Hill if you want a view on how the community thinks about computing, and that's great. But I really think if the community agrees, Peter and the Government Affairs Committee could be much more proactive of bringing things up to decision makers before it if you like, spirals out of control. So being more proactive can be done while still being neutral about how you think about proposing those ideas.
Yeah.
And I just want to mention that the A1A strategic initiative is define tenets and practices for socially responsible computing. So at some level, I think the sense of the strategic planning committee is that understanding what is socially responsible and having a voice about that is part of the role of CRA.
Yeah. So there's a thread here about participation and access in CRA events, and kind of it starts with this notion about alternating online and in person, but then it goes into the notion that there are systemic reasons why some organizations and individuals have not been as able to be engaged in the work of CRA. And so clearly a line of thinking through this strategic plan and expressed directly in some of these initiatives is to make the organization more accessible and create opportunities for additional engagement among those in the community research community, particularly among members. And so I just wonder if any of the committee members have some specific thoughts about looking to the future. Kind of what do you see as the blend of online, in-person, other types of engagements that could allow more inclusion of participation? Anybody want to address that one? Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I just want to put in a plug for a panel session. So I'm on the panel that's going to discuss COVID-19 and the impact on research and collaboration. And I just want to mention that I think that as bad as COVID is, it's creating opportunities for us to understand better how virtual technology can reach a much wider audience. So for example, virtual conferences now, many have no registration fees, and they're seeing three times the registrations that they've seen in the past. So that means a lot of people are seeing these things that didn't used to be able to participate in that way. So I do think that understanding how this technology aligns with reaching a broader audience, bringing more people to the table is very important. And I think, I'll just say, I think we're just in the early days of really understanding how to do this well. COVID sort of has been a forcing function to move us into a world where we understand that everyone in the world should be participating in all these events, and the physical barriers should not be the reason that people don't participate. So I think it's a great tragedy, but on the other hand, I think we are in a great experiment as well.
Yeah. So Ron, do you want to weigh in here as someone who's from a relatively smaller organization about access for opportunity? Oh, and Ayana, I'm sorry. I'm looking all over the place here. Go ahead, Ayana.
Yeah, so I just kind of segueing into what Ben was saying. So one of the things I think that this current situation has really shown us is, one, there are ways to increase access, but we are also finding out that there are some inequities, especially with respect to computing. And I think one of the things about the strategic initiatives is that there is a focus on equity and inclusion. And so if you think about the panel we had on teaching earlier and how do you teach and things like that, I think those are the kinds of activities that CRA wants to do moving forward in terms of rethinking even what's the role of education to ensure that we have different pathways into computing research and into jobs and into graduate education as well. So I think that is part of the core of what we think about the future strategy at CRA.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, Andy.
I guess I'm the resident Luddite on the panel. I don't disagree with Ben. There's things about this approach that are great. I mean, think of our carbon impact, for example. It's much better this way. There's more access to people. There's all kinds of good features, but we also miss a lot. One of the beautiful things about Snowbird is when you walk around the conference, the original conference in person, you walk around and you see the department head from the University of Southeastern State College talking to Eric Grimson when he was the department head at MIT. There is no other way that that happens. And maybe there's a technological way to make that happen, but I haven't seen it. I would hate to miss that. And I think the department head from Southern Eastern State College would hate to miss that. And I hope Eric from MIT would hate to miss that as well.
Yeah, so clearly it's not an either or, right? We've got to find all kinds of opportunities, but be mindful that we can't say we're going to broaden engagement and participation to different types of people and different types of organizations and keep doing things the same way that we've done them in the past. And so there's an additional question I wanted to get to about the explosion of computing education and the economic impact may mean that to truly broaden participation, we have to play down the R. And I know that's something that the group has kind of discussed and made some choices about maintaining this focus on computing research and versus broadening to computer science more generally. And so would somebody want to maybe address some of that thinking?
I can take it, Martha.
Thanks, Ellen.
I'm actually not completely sure I 100% understand the question. So Aaron, if you want to post an additional explanation, go ahead. You're linking, I think you're trying to argue that the research piece, a focus on the research piece makes it difficult perhaps for us to broaden participation. And we do have a focus on, and I won't use the word pipeline. I think that's been, we're all excising that from our vocabulary, but pathways. And so through the work of CRAWP and CRA education part, we do invest effort and care a lot about the various ways that people come into and go mostly move through computing education. And we know that they will not all go on to graduate school. They will not all do research. And there are still things happening in widening participation in education that help them. I do think, though, that we have felt in the strategic planning discussions pretty strongly that the R, that having the R in there gives the organization a focus that is valuable. And that if we were to try to become the computing association with just as much, say, emphasis on the education component, that it would really be it could potentially be a very sort of diluted mission if it were as broad as all of computing education, and that we've really gotten some been able to make progress with a focus on research, but understanding that for that ecosystem to be a good one, we do need to reach out into other parts of academic enterprise and therefore touch a number of things that have to do with computing education.
If I could jump in here as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I could be misinterpreting the question, so apologies if that's the case, but there seems to be an implication that the R that is computing research is in part somehow either an additional barrier to or is frightening away broad participation. I think it's fair to say that what we believe is that if that is the case right now, it should not be, and that computing generally, certainly not just computing research, but computing generally and computing research as well, all will benefit tremendously from the widest participation possible of all who are interested in participating in this area. And so what's important is not to think about how we aren't succeeding right now, but turn things on their heads and think about how we can create the full range of pathways that are necessary, the full range of supports that are necessary, change our research ecosystem, change our ways of treating individuals and groups in our institutions in order to not make the R in our mission somehow the barrier.
Yeah, and that actually kind of hooks into a question that Randall Burns posted about, undergraduate degrees that students can complete without prior training is a great on-ramp. And so this notion about how CRA could inform curriculum and major requirements to really with this diversity of pathways into computing research that the committee has talked about. And so, Ayana, do you want to maybe start with a response to some ideas about that question?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, and this is dealing with the onboarding, on-ramping, and this aspect of research and expanding. So I think so thinking about the mission of the CRA in terms of the future, one of the things is if you think about pathways, and there's been enough studies that have shown that when we talk about research, it's not the classical, oh, I'm going to do a PhD research, but there's something magical about having a student in terms of self-efficacy, in terms of believing and seeing yourself as a computer scientist when they do this thing we call research. And enough studies have shown that outside of the classroom, it's the one thing that keeps students engaged, especially underrepresented students that are traditionally in computing. And so I think one of the things about this mission is how do you keep that as a thread because it's been validated and proven that it works. And there's other things that also work, but that aspect of R actually does work. I mean, there's been data to show that. But then how do you make it so that it is more accessible? How do you make it so that if you're at an institution that doesn't necessarily have faculty that think about research in that way, that you provide that as a resource and you provide that as an infrastructure, I think is the challenge that CRA should address and continue to try to push forward in general. But I actually worry about dropping the R just because the studies have shown it, that R for a lot of students says, like, I can do this and I see myself because I can accomplish something, even if in my class I don't see someone that looks like me.
Yeah.
Martha,
And I'm actually, yeah, go ahead, Eric, please.
sorry, just to add to that quickly, both to Ayana's point and to the earlier discussion. The R needs, in many cases, I think, to be broader. We've already seen it. Things are so much more interdisciplinary now. So research can be somebody coming from material science that really wants to understand how to do computation, or from economics, or from city planning, or wherever. So to Aaron's original point, in some sense, maybe it's not just drop the R, but make R much broader, that the research has to come from so many different cases. And I think it goes back to Ayana's point that then there are many different on-ramps that bring you into the field that come from different directions.
So I'd actually like to hear, Chris and Ben respond to this, because we've kind of talked about it from the academic perspective in terms of, what students are studying, but I'm also wondering from the corporate perspective, from the industry perspective, in terms of the work and this distinct focus on computing research and how that's defined in industry and how diverse people can get involved in that. And so I don't know, Chris or Ben, if you want to talk about that distinction in your universe.
So, Chris, you want to try?
Well, I think a lot of the companies in the computing research arena are wholly dedicated to increasing diversity and to having representation from broad set of constituents. It helps us find better problems, address the right issues. So certainly education, it plays an important role in creating a representative computing research community. I think one of the things that came out in the strategic planning process was the importance of sort of looking forward and addressing societal issues that are arising around responsible computing. And that's going to be very hard to achieve if we don't educate diverse workforces, bring them together to look at these problems. And CRA, because it touches government, it touches universities, it touches industry, seems to be really well positioned to be a leader, being proactive in addressing, identifying and addressing some of these issues and then responding to them.
Thanks, Chris. Ben, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, so I would just add to that, that I think, when you say research, what does that really mean? It means pushing the boundaries in some way, right? Taking things to a place where they haven't been before. And I think what we're looking at right now in terms of the expansion of computing technology into so many different new areas, that almost everything people do to find a way to apply that technology to a new problem, you could consider research. And so I think one of the reasons that we're looking at a much broader audience for the technology is because there are many new opportunities to find ways to apply it. And so anybody that wants to take technology and use it in innovative ways, I think, is doing research, which means that anybody who graduates from college, in theory, if they want to do that innovation, has that kind of underlying motivation.
And if I could just build one more time on that.
Please, Chris.
Everything that is happening today seems to involve computing in some form or another. And so all of the evolution that's happening, it's not a computing research enterprise as a separate entity. It's much more closely intertwined in all of our lives. And so the importance of doing that in in a way that sort of recognizes the needs of the industry and society as a whole, I think has got to be an important part of CRA's mission going forward.
And I just want to mention that Ben is with Microsoft and Chris is with VMware, and Andrea's with Williams College, and Ayana's with Georgia Tech, and Eric's with MIT. So we've got kind of a broad range of perspectives going on here. Ellen, of course, is also with Georgia Tech. And Ron, I don't know, do you want to weigh in this also from the perspective of a primarily undergraduate institution and how the focus on research is interpreted from your sort of side of the fence?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Martha. I guess I maybe share two perspectives. One is from a small college, and also one is from the CRA Education Committee, where I've been serving for some time. I think, like Andrea, small colleges, our agendas are different from the R1 schools, but I think it's incredibly powerful for us to have an opportunity to interact with our colleagues at large universities for a number of reasons. One is that we hope to send our students to those schools, and so for graduate studies. And so having an opportunity to engage with that community, understand sort of what the best way to advise our students in terms of getting into graduate school is, what are current practices and admissions and so forth, is all extremely useful. Let me also say that with respect to CRA Education Committee, our primary agenda in the last several years has really been pipeline issues, which is being concerned about the domestic pipeline of undergraduates going on to graduate school in computer science or computing in general. And the issue of curriculum is a really, really important one, but I think we've just felt that we don't have the cycles. We're a very small organization, relatively speaking. There's other organizations that do this quite well, and we've just decided to avoid reinventing that wheel. But it's an important wheel for sure.
All right, great. So any other thoughts from the group about, ways to broaden, engagement with CRA from a broader sector of organizations, a broader spectrum of organizations? And I will also throw out here this conversation we had at the board and at the committee about the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary opportunities. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Burnett. I'm the executive director of CRA, which I forgot to mention the last time I spoke. Years ago, when I was a department head at a lower class type of institution, and I wanted to join CRA, they said no. Only the upper level schools, only the really high level research schools could even join CRA. Now we have all sorts of members at CRA, and I want to emphasize that fact that if you're interested and at all engaged in research, CRA welcomes you. If you look at the dues schedule, and we need dues money to pay the bills. If you look at the dues schedule, it's very, very inexpensive for non-PhD granting programs. We do this on purpose. The next question is about representation in committees and the board and so on. And that, I fully admit, is an issue, and we're working on it. I hope the strategic planning process can really address that issue. It's important.
Alan?
Thanks, Martha. I don't remember I introduced myself in the last minute. I'm chair of the CRA board. I think you already heard I'm at Georgia Tech, so that's my other hat. And with that hat, I think we have a lot of work to do on this issue. I think it's extremely difficult to get elected to the board without coming from an R1 institution, because it relies somewhat on people knowing who you are, and R1 institution folks seem to have a greater opportunity to network with and be known in communities. And as Andy alluded, being on the board is not the only way to be participant in CRA, but it does, there has historically been, I think, an outsized opportunity for board members to influence what CRA does. And one of the things we are committed to changing and it's in the strategic plan, is to have a more open, transparent, and accessible process for getting issues that are important to members onto the agenda and laying a claim to resources that CRA can put behind issues. And I think we don't have as much understanding of the things that are pressing in the minds of, for instance, R2 institutions as we do for R1 institutions. We do have people like Ron and Andrea who are coming from small liberal arts colleges who do give us I think some window into how those issues are different from R1s. But I do think, you know, and Janet, you asked some questions about this. I think this is an issue and it's time to do something about it. And I think there's a commitment expressed in the strategic plan and also held by the board about doing so.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for all of this time and these fabulous questions. I do want to just take a moment. I believe that we're going to be posting into the Slido exchange, and we'll also try to find a way to get this out to the entire conference participants. But we have provided an opportunity through a tool called Thought Exchange. It's very painless. It'll take you about 10 minutes to participate, and then we'd like you to go back in the morning and participate again. It asks you which of the objectives, and those are listed in the exchange, which you would have as your priorities for approaching first, and which you would have as a priority for approaching second. So if you could select the things for CRA to work on first, what would be your first choice and your second choice? And then it also asks for you to provide whatever insights you have about what are the critical success factors to ensure that the strategic plan is successfully implemented. And we've heard some of those ideas today, but we'd really like to hear some more ideas. So you can enter the tool. It's completely anonymous. It won't keep track of any of your information. However, when you do return to the tool tomorrow from the same device, it'll recognize your device, and it'll give you an opportunity to rate some ideas of other people that you haven't rated yet. So when you go in today, you'll actually be able to enter your ideas, rate some ideas, and then go back in tomorrow, rate some more ideas, and then tomorrow's strategic planning question or session will be specifically to review your input and allow the group to have a conversation about that. So I do want to thank the Strategic Planning Committee members here for their diligent work so far and their thoughtful participation in this session. And Ellen, is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
I guess the only thing I want to say is that we do really appreciate all forms of input about the strategic plan. As I said in my canned remarks, we very much wanted Snowbird to be an opportunity to hear from a broader audience and directly from all of you as members. So in the thought exchange is one forum for that, but feel free to use other forums as well. You can email me, you can email Andy, you know, whatever method works for you to get us feedback would be welcome. It'd be really awesome if it's in the thought exchange, because that way we could include it in tomorrow's conversation.
Yeah, the thought exchange also gives you the opportunity to express preference in terms of order of ideas. So it's a crowdsourcing tool as well as an opportunity for input. So it will help to set some priorities for the board. So I think that's it for our session today, and just want to thank everybody for participating. There's more sessions after the break, so please return at 4 o'clock and pick up the next session. Ron, anything else you want to say from a conference management standpoint? All right, we're good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.